From the Capitol Public Radio studios in Sacramento, this is At Issue. I'm Bill Rickman. The economic story of the 1980s was the sudden emergence of Japanese companies as leaders in the international business community. Subsidiaries dot the landscape of virtually every country in the world. Today we talk with Doug Lipp, an international business consultant and co-author of the new book, Danger and Opportunity, Resolving Conflict in U.S.-based Japanese Subsidiaries, and talk about how these businesses are faring as the world economy enters the new millennium, and how Japanese companies are blending into their adopted homes in places like Sacramento. Doug, welcome to At Issue.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Doug, first of all, I'd like to get to know something about you. Tell me about your business, what you do.
Well, my business basically is working with American companies that move into Japan and Japanese companies that move into the U.S. I personally have been involved with Japan for 25 years. I worked for the Disney organization, and I saw firsthand when I worked for Disney how a major corporation made some mistakes in a foreign environment and also had some successes. And on the flip side, I also worked for NEC Electronics locally in Sacramento for a number of years and saw some great examples of success, and I also saw some areas where improvement could be made in international business dealings.
When do companies call you?
They call me usually when they've got a problem. I'd like to have them do more proactive work, but usually it's when they're faced with a lawsuit. For example, a Japanese company is faced with a lawsuit because they've not managed their American resources correctly, or in fact when an American company has gone to Japan and they've lost a tremendous amount of market share in Japan because they've mismanaged their strategic approach to the Japanese market.
Let's go back in time now, back into the 1980s. Japanese companies are exploding on the international economy.
Right.
What impact did that have in Japan?
Well, there was a whole issue in Japan during the 1980s when their pricing was astronomical. Their hourly rates were too high, so many Japanese companies were going overseas. And they had something called the Hollowization of Japan, which basically meant that their core industries were leaving in droves to America.
Let's jump back and say their pricing was astronomical. What do you mean?
Pricing basically mean their labor costs. So they were pricing themselves out of the domestic market, and in order to maintain a competitive edge against imports from Southeast Asia, they then had to go to Southeast Asia to produce their goods and then re-import those back into Japan. At the same time, they came to the U.S. because of primarily the threat of trade sanctions against Japanese corporations. It wasn't that our labor costs were that much lower. It was primarily because the Japanese knew that unless they were establishing a foothold domestically, that they faced potential political backlash because of the charges of dumping and that sort of thing in the U.S.
Now, let's get to the Hollowization of Japan. What was happening there?
The Hollowization basically meant that if you've got this large factory called Japan, and then slowly but surely all the components of that factory, whether it's the lathes or the machinists or the administrative staff, are slowly leaving, then sooner or later that factory becomes hollow. That was the metaphor that the Japanese were using for their corporate mindset in Japan called Japan Incorporated. Japan is a very homogeneous culture, very homogeneous entity, and they felt that they were losing their vital resources to other countries. Therefore, they called it the Hollowization of Japan.
And how did they react to that?
Well, the reaction was basically it was economically driven, and they knew that if they did not establish a foothold overseas, that sooner or later those industries were going to fail. So basically, they supported it.
Is that going on now?
Not as much now. In fact, what's happening since the 1980s, of course, in 1989, really the beginning of the Japanese recession began, and it's been going on for over a decade now. And what's happening on the flip side is that some of these Japanese companies are pulling back from overseas investments because they have to retrench at home due to the tenuous situation at corporate headquarters, whether that corporate headquarters be in Osaka or Tokyo.
Let's move forward from that just a little bit into the middle 80s in the United States. United States business, we're looking at the Japanese as models.
Indeed. In the 1980s, actually in the mid-70s to mid-80s, most American businesses were looking toward Japan for guidance, whether it was quality control circles, how to manage a factory, how to be more efficient, and quite frankly, the Japanese were very good with commodity products. And how do you create an automobile, or how do you create a microprocessor so that over and over again you're slowly improving the efficiencies of when you build a product like that. American quality in the 1980s was terrible at best, and the Japanese had very strict rules of how do you go about maintaining quality in products.
How did those two systems come together then?
The 1980s for the United States was a time of realization that we did not have a monopoly on business around the world. Our quality was suffering. During the 80s, the Japanese quality was basically at its zenith. And one of the things that we were facing also during the 80s was our savings and loan crisis. So there was, I think, a national mindset in the U.S. of inferiority, for lack of a better term. And we were looking for models that we could emulate that would help our industries turn themselves around. On the flip side, during the 80s, the 70s, and 80s, the Japanese actually became exceedingly arrogant because of their supposed recession-proof economies, their outstanding quality of products, and therefore they wanted to actually teach as many people as possible around the world the Japanese way, so to speak.
And how did they do that?
Well, in many cases, what the Japanese did to sell their products and to promote their way was they invited a lot of foreign business people to Japan, a lot of scholars, a lot of executives to tour their factories, to see how the Japanese way was done. And those executives, those scholars in turn came back to the U.S., went back to the UK, wherever, and started basically beating the drum of the Japanese way. I think professors from Stanford University to Oxford were the ones that were saying the Japanese style is the way to follow.
Local communities were forming economic outreach programs for Japanese companies as well.
Exactly. The economic development corporations in a number of municipalities around the U.S. were basically saying our tax coffers are suffering. We don't have the tax base that we had from our U.S.-based corporations. Therefore, we have to go overseas and attract investment from someone else. And at the time, the target was primarily Japan. And it was a wonderful opportunity because the Japanese, like I said earlier, needed to cushion themselves against the possibility of trade sanctions, and the American municipalities really wanted to have some kind of a safety net for their economic well-being.
And Sacramento was no exception.
No exception at all. In fact, Bill, one of the things that Sacramento has been very successful in doing over the last decade is attracting Japanese investment. It's been an effort that's been going on since the mid-1970s, and it paid off handsomely over the last 10 years.
I'm sure we're familiar with the larger Japanese corporations in our area, but let's just list some of the Japanese companies that have located here in the last 15 years or so.
Certainly. Well, the big names that I think most listeners would be familiar with would be JVC, for example, Japan Victor Corporation. Kikkoman is famous for its food products and soy sauces. Of course, NEC Electronics is the largest investor in the Sacramento area. Another one would be Mitsubishi Rayon. They make graphite products for everything from fishing poles to gasoline tanks to golf clubs. And then there are some smaller companies that aren't as well known to most Sacramentans, but they're huge players in Japan. For example, Ebara Pump is a pump manufacturer that supplies high-tech pump products to the high-tech microprocessing industries.
Now, these industries have become part of our community here. They're very important.
Absolutely, Bill. These corporations, there are about 25 Japanese facilities in the Sacramento area right now, and they actually account for close to 6,000 jobs in the area. Economically speaking, they account for about $2.2 billion of investment in the local area. So there's an absolutely huge connection between our economic well-being and basically the economic well-being of these corporations.
Now, obviously, since they're Japanese-owned and satellite operations, they're sending money back to Japan. How important is that flow back to the Japanese economy right now?
Well, now more than ever, that flow is absolutely critical to the survival rate of these local Japanese subsidiaries as well as their parent companies back in Japan. Within the last 2-3 years, especially since 1997, with the problem with the bot in Thailand and the expanding Asian flu, the Japanese economy has taken a tremendous hit in the last 2 years. And as a result, a lot of these Japanese corporations in Japan are now telling their subsidiaries overseas that they have to produce, they have to stand independently from an economic perspective. And the more that those overseas subsidiaries can send back profits to the home country and the headquarters, the better off everybody will be.
And is that happening?
It's happening in many cases. Unfortunately, some Japanese companies have had to shut down. I think the one that made the most headlines in the California market was Sumitomo Bank. Even though they were making money in the United States, the banking industry was in such dire straits in Japan that Sumitomo Corporation basically was divesting itself of many of its operations overseas and retrenching back in Japan.
When did they shut down?
Sumitomo closed down, I think it was last year. In fact, when I was in Japan not too many months ago talking to some bankers, a lot of the bankers were saying this is just the tip of the iceberg. Many of the overseas Japanese companies are actually exceedingly profitable, but they're still facing tremendous pressure from corporate headquarters to turn even better profits for them.
So the California, let's just take California since that's where we are, even though we could talk about overseas, but let's say the California satellite operations doing very, very well on their own right, but the parent companies back home want more.
Right, and one of the problems, really, the seeds of this were sown in the mid-1980s when we heard about the Japanese investing in a lot of these trophy properties, for lack of a better term. I think the biggest one that we heard about in the United States, or at least in the West Coast, was the Pebble Beach Company. And there was a Japanese investor who paid an astronomically high price for the Pebble Beach Company, thinking that he would be able to turn a profit, but there was absolutely no way when the Japanese economy collapsed that he could wait for the long run to amortize or to realize the profits from that investment. And a lot of the Japanese companies, even though they are quote-unquote making a profit on the products that they're selling, the properties that they purchased are at such an inflated rate that they cannot realize the loans there.
So what's happening with those trophy properties?
A lot of those trophy properties are being sold for cents on the dollar to other investors in the U.S.
Let's get back to the companies now that impact our local economy and the kinds of companies that we have maybe not, well, we can talk about specifically the companies in Sacramento if you like, but let's still go back into the middle 80s when they were first arriving here and hiring American workforces. Obviously a culture clash in the making there.
No question. Every country has its thoughts that it's got an answer to how to do certain things, and the Japanese are no exception. We heard about the ugly Americans post-World War II when we went around the world selling our products and manufacturing products overseas, and the Japanese are no exception. They came to the U.S. in great droves in the late 70s through the mid-80s and absolutely faced a number of problems from the standpoint of how do you manage the locally hired American workforce. One of the things that we found is that the Japanese traditionally had been very, very astute at altering a product for export, whether it was a motorcycle, whether it was a dynamic RAM microprocessing chip, or an automobile. All of that engineering was done in Japan, and the only thing that they had to change was their marketing strategy in the U.S., or if they had the steering wheel on the right-hand side of the car or the left-hand side of the car. Relatively speaking, those kinds of cultural alterations, for lack of a better term, are pretty darned easy. The big challenge came when these Japanese corporations realized that they were now opening up overseas operations and they had to be managed by experts from Japan. Those experts came to the U.S. not having a clue as to how to balance both their technical side of the business along with hiring and maintaining a viable U.S. workforce.
Beyond the products and getting the products done, though, there was the managing of the workforces and a clash of styles between how they were used to managing their Japanese workers and how all of a sudden they're in an American culture, and there's a clash of styles here that you allude to in your book.
Right. You've got the hard skills and the soft skills. And the hard skills, for example, would be the skills that a Japanese engineer or technician or production operator brings from Japan that basically says, I can get this product through the factory in high quality in low amount of time, very quickly turning this product around. That's only one part of the equation. The equation that I address in my book is basically the soft side, which means how do I attract quality employees to my office, to my factory, to my place of work? How do I manage that American workforce so that I can get a highly motivated, highly efficient work team combining with the technical know-how of the Japanese leadership? And that was what was falling down in the mid-'80s through basically today still, as many of the Japanese have come to the U.S. with the mindset, as long as I speak a little bit of English, it doesn't really matter what I do because the Japanese way is the best and the Americans will listen to me regardless of my style.
We're talking with Doug Lipp. He's a co-author of a new book, Danger and Opportunity, Resolving Conflict in U.S.-Based Japanese Subsidiaries. He's an international business consultant specializing in Japanese-American companies. As those companies brought their managers over, what difficulties and surprises did they encounter?
I think one of the biggest surprises the Japanese managers encountered was that the American workforce was fairly vocal as far as what they wanted or didn't want. The Japanese workforce in Japan traditionally has been one that followed direction of a superior, even if that superior said jump off the cliff without a parachute. American workforce would say, excuse me, boss, I'd like a parachute, and besides a parachute, I'd like it in the color that I like. Don't tell me that I have to do something that I don't agree with. So the American workforce was very much used to having a say in how things were done.
How did the Japanese managers react to this?
The Japanese reaction to a subordinate basically having an opinion was, first of all, jaw-dropping surprise. How could you be so insolent? How dare you challenge my authority? From the American perspective, it wasn't challenging authority, it was just engaging in dialogue or open, clear debate. And one of the funny stories that I've heard from a lot of my Japanese counterparts is they'll say, in Japan, you go to school, whether it's high school or college, and you listen to the teacher and you do what the teacher says. From my perspective, I can remember going to high school and college in this country, and a lot of us probably can as well, and we've attended classes where the instructor would say, in order for you to get an A in this course, you have to come to class every day, you have to take tests, get good grades, and you have to participate in class, meaning challenge me, the instructor, challenge each other with ideas and debate. And that's just a fundamental difference between the two cultures.
But there were some other differences too, weren't there? I mean, Americans aren't used to devoting their whole lives to their company, and some Japanese workers do that.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the 8 topics that I identify in the book, and there are primarily 8 areas of continual friction between Japanese managers and American workforce. One of those is an area of work habits. In other words, how many hours a week do you work? In polling thousands of Japanese employees over the years, a pretty common pattern that emerges is this. Monday through Friday, I, the Japanese worker, belong to my Japanese company. Therefore, if I get any free time at all, I consider myself very lucky. On the flip side, Americans will say, well, I'm devoted to my company, but I've also got issues outside of work that I consider as important or more important than my work life, whether it's family issues, church issues, volunteer organizations. So I expect free time Monday through Friday as a given, and if that's impinged upon or encroached upon, then I start to get a little upset.
You mentioned something in your book I thought was fascinating, the Japanese idea of perfection as part of their cultural outlook, transplanted here, and they ran into a little bit different view on that.
I think the idea that the Japanese have of perfection is looking at a model of behavior, looking at a model of production, and slowly but surely evolving that into the most watertight, airtight product possible. That's wonderful for commodity products. It does not help them at all, though, when you are in a very fast-paced environment such as we have in the U.S. with the high-tech environment and e-commerce. Americans, on the flip side, usually go for the big picture. Let's put some ideas together, let's slam some ideas on the wall, let's brainstorm, and we'll take care of the small stuff later. Those two cultural dynamics, when they clash, cause a lot of fireworks in U.S.-based Japanese companies. The Japanese look at Americans as hip-shooting gunfighters, and the Americans look at the Japanese as these plodding bureaucrats who don't have a creative bone in their body.
Now, obviously, those differences have been reconciled in some way, or these companies wouldn't be here making the profits and contributing to our communities as they are.
Well, you're right. The reconciliation process has indeed evolved dramatically in the last 10 years. One of the driving forces of the reconciliation process for any company, not just U.S.-based Japanese, is monetary. When you lose market share, or when you have higher employee turnover, or you're faced with lawsuits because you're not handling property or people correctly, corporate headquarters wakes up and says, we've got to do something differently. So what's happened over the last decade is that a lot of these Japanese companies, in facing lawsuits, have indeed come up with new programs for their Japanese managers before they leave Japan to enlighten them basically on how do we manage Americans, how do we run a factory that it's so that it's efficient like it is in Japan, but it's run like the Americans appreciate, basically. And I think that's the essence of what we're talking about in any kind of an intercultural situation, is it can't be one way or another, it's got to be a blending of those two cultures to bring out the best of both.
Let's get concrete about this. Who bent where? Where were the changes made on each side?
Both sides made conciliatory approaches. I think the Japanese, for example, had managers that had been here for 4 or 5 years, and those Japanese managers realized that the American workforce was not the lazy, slovenly bunch of creatures that the Japanese had heretofore thought we were. They actually realized that these young engineers they were hiring out of universities in the U.S. had a brain, were very committed to the company and very loyal. Therefore, the Japanese bent in the way that they started giving Americans more leeway, letting them be more creative, and calling more shots. The Americans, on the other side, realized that in many cases we didn't have a very methodical approach to production techniques, and we were now willing to listen to our Japanese leaders, engineers, and managers and adopt some of their styles for quality control management.
These Japanese methods moved over into mainstream American companies. I mean, major car manufacturers, major goods manufacturers. Has there been an actual demonstrable influence there?
A huge influence. Even if an American industry did not call their total quality management Japanese-driven, many of the reasons U.S. industry in the late 70s picked up quality control circles and total quality management and actually started listening to the preaching of Edwards Deming or Joseph Juran from the quality control movement of the 50s and 60s in Japan was because basically at a global level the American industry was losing its competitive edge. And anytime we lose our competitive edge, we're looking for other ways to beat the competition. And at that time, the competition, which is always the driving force, was the Japanese machine. Therefore, the American industry was now willing to look for a way to resolve the quality issues that were basically cutting out the base of our international competitiveness.
How strong is the Japanese economy right now? We read a lot about it being deep in recession, teetering. They have government changes there frequently in recent years. How strong are they really over there?
Boy, if I had a crystal ball, I think that I could answer that much better than I probably will be able to. I visit Japan several times a year, and the last time I visited was a couple of months ago, and I talked with a number of bankers. And at that time, the bankers in unison said, we think that we've hit the bottom. And the reason we think we've hit the bottom is because the government is finally saying, we've made some mistakes. They nationalized some banks, they closed some banks, which basically was a public admission of fault and failure. And for the Japanese, that's a tremendous step in the right direction to take. Had they handled their bank and financial problems the way that we handled the S&L problem in the 80s, this 10-year recession would have been probably cut in half. The Nikkei Dow in the last few days has turned around, and I still think that the bankers that I talked to are right, that the Japanese economy has hit the bottom. It's turning around. It's still very tenuous, but there's no question in my mind that in spite of the economy, the Japanese production machine, the Japanese factories, and the Japanese workers are some of the most motivated, highly educated people in the world, and they are going to be a formidable force for the U.S. in the not-too-distant future.
Well, is it fair to say that they're learning from the United States now in this era?
That's a great point. It's just the reverse of what happened with us in the 1980s. We looked to them for production issues and how to retool our production facilities, and they've looked to us in this last decade in how to retool their financial services industries.
Looking down the road now in these Japanese-American companies, the NECs, for example, how are they going to prosper in the next millennium, would you guess?
My guess with the Japanese companies, and one of the areas that I criticize the Japanese in my book, is their operation systems, specifically their decision-making process. The Japanese are traditionally a very centralized decision-making machine. They don't let their subsidiaries make a lot of autonomous decisions. And one of the things that's driving the industry these days, whether it's in Japan, Europe, or the United States, is you have to decentralize the decision-making machine. And some of the Japanese companies that are extremely competitive at the international marketplace are saying to themselves, we are now going to turn over the decision-making to the local managers in Kokomo, Indiana, to the local managers in Sacramento, California, to the local managers in Ireland, instead of having to make all of our decisions back in Japan, because those decisions that we make in Japan are taking so long that we're missing a window of opportunity and the competitors from South Korea, the competitors from the U.S., wherever, are taking a lion's share of that market.
We're just about out of time, Doug, but I want to ask you what you think the benefits are. If you had to stand back and say, this is how the Japanese benefited and this is how the Americans benefited, especially the local economies on the American landscape, what were the benefits of these partnerships?
Well, certainly the benefit to the U.S. over the years has been, in hard dollars alone, incalculable. Nationwide in the U.S., there are about 1 million Americans employed by Japanese. There are probably about 4,000 Japanese companies in the U.S. alone. And as I mentioned before, in Sacramento, there's about 6,000 Sacramentans employed by 22 or so Japanese companies. In the local economy, that's about $2 billion worth of investment. We have benefited dramatically because our economic base has been broadened. We're no longer relying upon one or two industries in many of these communities. Likewise, I think the American industry has benefited from the Japanese expertise in quality control and total quality management techniques. On the flip side, I think what the Japanese have learned from us is the entrepreneurial spirit and how to be creative, how to question authority, how to challenge authority, and come up with new and better ideas at a much more rapid pace.
We've been talking with Doug Lipp, international business consultant and co-author of the new book, Danger and Opportunity, Resolving Conflict in U.S.-based Japanese Subsidiaries, published by Intercultural Press. And Doug, I imagine in this world you find your book online.
Absolutely. E-commerce is the name of the game these days. The book is available on Amazon.com and also on BarnesandNoble.com. This is a topic that I'm passionate about. As I said earlier, I've been in and out of Japan more than half of my life. I see so many successes in both countries, and I also see a lot of failures in both countries. And what I've tried to do over the last 8 years in writing this book was bring to light some of those successes and why they occur, and also bring to light why some of the failures occur and how we can avoid those in the future.
Thanks so much for coming to At Issue and helping us get a better look at some real economic partners, part of our Sacramento landscape. Thanks for coming to At Issue.
Thanks for having me, Bill.